Hello everybody, my name is Ryan Armstrong and you are watching the third episode of the 8 Biggest Objections to Christianity, which is a video series made for the Facebook group Apologetics for Christians. Now in this episode we're going to talk about the unbeliever's belief that evolution explains life, so God isn't needed. Now we're going to discuss evolutionary theory as well as explore Darwin's ideas on how life originated and compare them with what we know today. We're also going to discuss different modern-day theories on how life originated with our Creator. Now remember, the main purpose of this video is not to replace evolutionary theory with creationism, even though I wish it was, mostly because I have a 15-minute time limit and that requires way too much time. But it is to debunk the very foundation of evolutionary theory. So hopefully after you watch this video you'll understand why it is rational to deny it. Now I'm not going to be that guy that sits here and says that there's no such thing as eugenics or heredity or anything like that. Those are scientifically proven. However, Darwin's ideas go much further than those, claiming that life began millions of years ago with simple single-cell creatures and then developed through mutation and natural selection into the vast array of plant and animal life that populate the planet. And this is what we call macroevolution, and is actually the part that is controversial. See, no one disputes that you can change the genetic structure of a creature through many generations. Look at dogs. All the different breeds of dog descended from wolves long ago, and yet now we have Chihuahuas, Wiener Dogs, Cocker Spaniels, Irish Wolfhounds, you name it. But many people do question the authenticity of macroevolution. The biggest objection to macroevolution is the lack of fossil evidence to prove these transitions between the different evolutionary stages that man has supposedly gone throughout the course of time. Fast forward to 1979, 120 years after Darwin published his famous book On the Origin of Species, David M. Ropp, who was the curator for the Field Museum of Natural History in Chicago, said, "Knowledge of the fossil record has been greatly expanded. We now have 250,000 fossil species, but the situation hasn't changed much. We have even fewer examples of evolutionary transition than we had in Darwin's time. What the fossil record does show, however, is that around 570 million years ago there is the sudden appearance of nearly all of the animal phyla, and they appear fully formed, without a trace of the evolutionary ancestors that Darwinists require." And that was from Philip E. Johnson's Darwin on Trial. Darwin himself even stated that if it could be demonstrated that any complex organ existed which could not possibly have been formed by numerous, successive, slight modifications, then my theory would absolutely break down. Now this challenge was taken up from biochemist Michael Behe of Lee University in his book Darwin's Black Box, which showed how recent biochemical discoveries have found numerous examples of this very kind of irreducible complexity. Now, even though I don't agree with Darwin's theory on how life began, I do understand how perplexing this fundamental question of being is. It is a question of which the answer the individual chooses defines who that person is, whether it be merely a conglomeration of cells, or if that person believes he is a creation of God. Either way, we must attempt to rationalize why and how we exist in the first place. In this episode, we're going to listen to what Walter Bradley, author of The Mystery of Life's Origin, has to say about evolution's role in the life origin debate. Now, the first thing we need to find out, however, is how Darwin himself theorized life originated. And Darwin once wrote that it is often said that all conditions for the first production of a living organism are now present which could have ever been present. But if we could conceive in some warm little pond with all sorts of ammonia and phosphoric salts, light, heat, electricity, etc. present, that a protein compound was chemically formed ready to undergo still more complex changes, at the present day such matter would be devoured or absorbed, which would not have been the case before living creatures were formed. Now realize that Darwin did make that sound rather simple, but we also have to consider he wrote his thesis only about 200 years after we discovered that maggots don't spontaneously generate out of rotting meat, so he was more or less underestimating the problem. But later, during the 1920s, scientists theorized that spontaneous genesis doesn't happen in a short time frame, but with billions of years, maybe it is possible. And that has stood the test of time and is the basis for the idea that, given enough time, life could have sprung forth from some sort of primordial chemical soup. Later on, Nobel Prize winner Harold Urey suggested that the Earth's primitive atmosphere would have made it favorable for organic compounds to emerge. And it was Harold Urey who was the PhD advisor to Stanley Miller at the University of Chicago. And later, Miller decided to test this experimentally. Miller's experiment involved recreating the atmosphere of the primitive Earth, even shooting electricity through it to simulate lightning. After conducting the experiment, Miller found that amino acids, which are the building blocks of life, had been formed. This experiment was considered a major breakthrough at the time, and even chemist William Day stated that this is the first step in the creation of life and that it wasn't a chance event, but that it was inevitable. But the experiment had a major flaw with it. Walter Bradley says that Miller didn't have any real proof that the Earth's early atmosphere was composed of ammonia, methane, and hydrogen, which he used in his experiment. They based their theory on physical chemistry. They wanted to get a chemical reaction that would be favorable, and so they proposed that the atmosphere was rich in those gases. From 1980 on, NASA scientists have shown that the primitive Earth never had any methane, ammonia, or hydrogen to amount to anything. Instead, it was composed of water, carbon dioxide, and nitrogen, and you absolutely cannot get the same results with that mixture. More recent experiments has also proven this to be the case. We now see how the Earth didn't have some sort of primordial broth which could create what was needed to form life, but instead it was full of inert gases such as nitrogen and carbon dioxide. But Darwin did live at a time when simple single-celled creatures weren't considered much of life at all, and that the gap between living and non-living matter wasn't that wide. In 1905, Ernst Haeckel described living cells as merely homogeneous globules of plasm, and that was a while after Darwin's theory emerged. So they didn't have a way of seeing exactly how complex the membrane of a cell truly is like we do today. So let's talk as simply as possible. What is the most basic things that go into building a living organism? Bradley says essentially start with amino acids. They come in 80 different types, but only 20 of them are found in living organisms. And the trick is to isolate only the correct ones. Then they have to be linked in the right sequence in order to produce protein molecules. Now you may be thinking that this sounds somewhat simple, and you may still concur with the running theory that given enough time they'd sort themselves out and eventually get in the right sequence. Well, then you'd be wrong, because you'd also have to consider what else Bradley says about it. He says, other molecules tend to react more readily with amino acids than amino acids react with each other. So now you have the problem of how to eliminate these extraneous molecules, and even in the Miller experiment, only 2% of the material he produced was composed of amino acids, so you'd have a lot of other chemical material that would gum up the process. And if you thought that was a big enough complication, you need to also consider that there are an equal number of amino acids that are right and left-handed, and only left-handed ones work in living matter. Now you've got to get only these select ones to link together in the right sequence, and also you need the correct kind of chemical bonds, namely peptide bonds, and the correct places in order for the protein to be able to fold in a specific three-dimensional way. Otherwise it won't function. So we can already see how complicated it would be to create a protein molecule by mere chance. But that isn't even creating life. Even after doing that, you would still have to have about 200 protein molecules just to fit, just within the right functions to form a typical cell. So even if Miller's experiment did coincide with what gases in the early Earth possessed in its atmosphere, it still would be going against unfathomable odds to make any sort of living creature. The theory of random chance was popular when scientists believed in the idea of an infinitely old universe, which is called the steady state theory. So they thought, who knows what could happen with an infinite amount of time? And that's a rational thought given the theory that was running at the time. But with the discovery of background radiation in 1965, it was proven that the universe just hasn't been hanging around forever. And then the Big Bang theory came to dominate the scientific field. And today it's believed that our universe is roughly 14 billion years old and the Earth is around 5 billion years old. Now you may be thinking that 5 billion years is plenty of time for all that hoopla to occur, but you'd also need to consider that the Earth spent a long time cooling down to a temperature where it would support life. Bradley says that based on the discovery of microfossils, scientists have now estimated that the time gap between the Earth reaching the right temperature and the first emergence of life was only about 400 million years. And that's not much time for chemical evolution to take place considering all of the evidence against spontaneous genesis that we've already covered. Bradley goes on to say that if you took all the carbon in the universe and put it on the face of the Earth and allowed it to chemically react in the most rapid rate possible and left it for 1 billion years, the odds of creating just one functional protein molecule would be 1 chance in a 10 with 60 zeros after it. Now first I thought I was going to be going over more theories than just the primordial soup theory and the random chance theory, but my only options included theories that have been proven scientifically incorrect and ones that involved aliens and just simply ignored the problem of life's origin in the first place. The fact is that time after time scientists have come up short when they've tried to theorize how chemicals could evolve into living matter. Science is sort of at the end of its rope, at least for now anyway. When it comes to origin of life science. Klaus Dose, an expert biochemist, put it like this: More than 30 years of experimentation on the origin of life in the fields of chemical and molecular evolution have led to a better perception of the immensity of the problem rather than to its solution. At present, all discussions on principal theories and experiments in the field either end in stalemate or in a confession of ignorance. Even Stanley Miller, some 40 years after his famous experiment, said the problem of the origin of life has turned out to be much more difficult than I and most other people envisioned. In the end, I think it requires a lot more faith from evolutionists to keep believing that science will give them the answer eventually than it is for someone to believe that an intelligent force, or more specifically speaking, God, created life. Now, there's a large gap between living and non-living matter, and the steps that have to be taken to even begin to form a protein molecule is a daunting task and is extremely improbable. And even after that, there has to be many protein molecules to even begin to form a working cell, not to mention all of the other chemicals that go into making a working cell. After all of this theorizing, it's hard for me to imagine grasping onto evolutionary theory, and I often wonder why many scientists still cling to it rather than move on to something else. Bradley says, for some their philosophy gets in the way. If they're persuaded ahead of time that there isn't a God, then no matter how compelling the evidence, they'll always say, wait, and we'll find something better in the future. But that is a metaphysical argument. Simply put, evolutionary theory is somewhat in an intermission until it can come up with a better excuse on how it could possibly work. As for now, there is no solid evidence that proves that it is true, even to this day. Now, since it took so long to explain all the concepts I needed to fully put evolution to rest, I didn't have time to explain why it is rational, based on this evidence, to conclude that there is an intelligent designer. Now, I plan on making a video to complement this particular objection on a later date after all the 8 biggest objections are uploaded. The next objection goes back to the emotional aspect of ontology, claiming that God isn't worthy of worship if he kills innocent children. And until then, I'll be working on that video, and I'll try to get it finished on time this time. So I hope this video has taught you something, if in fact you watched the entire thing, and I hope that you are one step closer to understanding Christian faith. And I'll see you soon. Jesus love.